This action plan was drawn up in July 1991. It's almost the last thing I did in my early years of environmentalist interest, because my first wife died in November 91, and I really thought I had to concentrate on the children. So I stopped my active sort of involvement with environmental issues. So this was really the last thing I did, and I did it on global warming because I thought that was by far the most important of the environmental issues that were on the horizon at that time. And this, of course, was the year before the Earth Summit in Rio. And what I thought the government needed, because my experience with lead and my experience with catalytic converters and ionising radiation and ozone, what it had taught me was that the civil servants needed the most enormous push before they set off in the right direction. So I thought that I'd give them a little blueprint that any idiot could follow in order for them to solve global warming. Not by picking winners, but by setting a regulatory framework which would allow entrepreneurs to flourish within that regulatory framework. So I drew up this action. I sat down with a few friends of mine from the environmental movement, particularly Stuart Boyle, who talked earlier this week, and in fact who wrote a book in 1989 called The Greenhouse Effect. So he was well ahead of the curve. And I sent it to Professor Sir William Stewart, who was at that time Chief Scientific Advisor to the Cabinet. And he was actually in the Chief Scientific Advisor for 5 years, from 1990 to 95. And I published a follow-up actually in The Guardian about 2 years later. They gave it a headline, Britain's Environmental Isolation, in which I reviewed progress on the sort of 40-point action plan that I'd given them. The gist of the letter was there hadn't been very much progress. So they were not only given the plan, they were also slightly chastised publicly for not having implemented it. It may be no coincidence that John Major was the Prime Minister from 1990 to 97. And of course, John Major, whatever his other qualities were, certainly didn't have an academic degree. He left school at 16, and he certainly didn't have a scientific degree. Thatcher, on the other hand, had a chemistry degree from Oxford, and was much quicker to get it because Crispin Tickell made considerable efforts to educate Thatcher about the environment. And it was actually under Thatcher that all the major environmental progress in the 80s was made in this country. They call it the golden age of environmental campaigning, but actually it was probably because Thatcher had a science degree and could understand the force of the arguments that were being put to her. So global warming might have been very different if Thatcher had carried on a bit longer. Have I got any slides?
I've not received the presentation, no.
Pardon?
I've not received the presentation, no.
Yeah, we put it on when I first came in on Monday, actually. It's called 40-point action plan or something like that. It's on should be on your thing there.
While you're doing it, interesting, when the government brought out NFOD, non-fossil fuel obligation, I was in Cornwall, and they rang me up and said, look, we're designing this package especially for you. But I was warned before that. So I said, what you mean is you're supporting the nuclear industry, because that's where all the funds went.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's what it was about. Yeah.
So are we moving forward here?
That's backwards, I think. Right.
Okay. So I have a 20-point checklist to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide, which, if implemented, would allow the UK to match Germany's proposal at that time for a 30% cut in carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2005. Please note at that time, Germany was amending or enacting 32 items of legislation related to global warming. So the first suggestion was the obvious one, to increase the cost of all fossil fuel-derived energy by means of a carbon tax, energy tax. This was sort of partly implemented in the guise of the carbon floor price and the fuel escalator. However, there is still no substitute for taxing fossil fuels globally at source when they come out the ground. So I gave the government half a point for that.
Could I just say something, Robert? I think much clearer if that word energy was changed to fossil fuel.
Yeah, Okay, well, this was early days, Peter. This was, you know, embryonic thoughts 21 years ago. Yeah. I suggested the changes should be introduced gradually, 10 to 15% per year over 5 years, to alleviate the recessionary impact of reducing direct taxation. In other words, to transfer money from income tax to fossil fuel tax. This was not done. I said the revenue should be used to promote energy efficiency, and this could be a major vote winner. This was not done. Establish an energy efficiency agency dedicated to educating and promoting the optimum use of energy, as recommended by the Energy Select Committee that year. That was not done. Drastically increase the number of energy efficiency officers. Actually, the EEOs have been abolished, so that's -1 point. Well, we should have moved on, shouldn't we? Okay. The next group of measures was to introduce energy efficiency standards for domestic appliances such as refrigerators, boilers and lighting, and they've done that, so they got a point for that. Introduce progressively higher standards in line with the best available technology. Thermal efficiency of UK fridges at that time was 2 to 3 times worse than the best available on the UK market, 10 times worse than the low energy fridges available in Denmark, called Gram refrigerators. This has partly happened, so half a point. Make labelling of such appliances compulsory, not voluntary, as is currently being proposed. That's partly been done, so another half point. Building regulations. Introduce progressively higher standards for new buildings in line with best available technology. Current requirements for domestic buildings in the UK were equivalent to those being used in Scandinavian houses 30 years previously. Current Swedish regulations stipulate maximum U values of 0.15 for the roof, 0.2 for the walls and windows, walls and floors, and 1.5 for the windows. Well, this has been done in a sort of roundabout way, but the problem is that the builders don't always do what's required, and there's no proper inspection that they've actually done it. They may do this with old houses that are being renovated and you get a council grant or something like that, but when you're building a new building, people who inspect the houses don't actually expect to see if the energy efficiency measures have actually been put in place. They're only worried about whether the house is going to fall down or not. So half a point. 6, that's going the wrong way, isn't it? So establish the energy rating for existing buildings. Currently there are 2 privately run schemes, the National Energy Rating Scheme and the Starpoint Scheme. These use different rating scales, which is confusing. There should be one government-approved scheme only. So HMG have introduced an energy performance certificate. However, they've also abolished HIPs, so they only get half a point for that. All council private property should be energy rated by law at the point of sale. They've done that, so that's a point. Grants should be introduced for improvement in energy efficiency and could be available for households through local councils, double glazing, gas condensing boilers, loft insulation, etc., or administered by energy efficiency officers for industry. They've partly done that, so they get half a point. Transport accounts for 22% of CO2 production in the UK, therefore introduce incentives to encourage rail and discourage road transport. On the contrary, government has encouraged road use and privatised the railways, so that's minus a point. Penalise cars with larger engines, relate road tax to the CC of the engine as is done in Germany, or to the pollution emitted by the vehicle. They've partly done that, so they get half a point. For new cars, introduce progressively higher standards of fuel efficiency in line with best available technology. This has been done elsewhere, but not in the UK. Electricity supply industry accounts for 30% of carbon production in the UK. Prohibit the construction of any new fossil fuel power station until energy efficient measures have been implemented and maximised nationwide. This has not been done. UK is still building new coal-fired power stations which are supposed to rely on carbon capture, which is as yet an unproven technology. Amend legislation so that the electricity supply industry can pass on the cost of energy efficiency measures directly to the consumer. as has been done recently in the gas industry, and allow the ESI higher profits on the energy efficiency side than the supply side. This has not been done. Develop an integrated plan to reduce CO2 throughout industry, i.e. ESI, distribution companies, local councils, consumers, and set targets as recommended by the Energy Select Committee. Not done. Introduce financial incentives for the construction of combined heat and power plants in urban areas. Not done. Reduce energy demand by industry by means of reuse and recycle policies, particularly for steel, glass and paper. The percentage of recycled material within a product should be made mandatory. Not done. So the total score was plus 5.5, minus 2, net score for the carbon emissions 3.5 out of 20. Now, Her Majesty's Government claims that the UK has reduced its carbon footprint in the form of carbon emissions by 23% between 1990 and 2009. In fact, the UK has simply imported more and therefore parked its carbon emissions offshore. If this is taken into account, the UK's carbon emissions have actually increased by 20% between 1990 and 2009. So the government claim that it's a world leader in carbon reduction is complete rubbish. Methane emissions, 5-point checklist. Methane accounts for 20% of global warming due to CO2 alone. So legislate to reduce leakage of methane, that is natural gas, from distribution systems. No legislation, not done. Introduce financial incentives for waste methane collection from landfill sites and coal mines. Not done. Use this methane as an energy source. Done for landfill but not for mines, so half a point. Set up a methane monitoring network in the UK, preferably coal and industry funded. Not done. Direct agricultural subsidy towards low methane producing activities in the farming industry. Not done. Sorry. 5-point checklist to reduce ground level ozone. Tropospheric ozone, that is below 10 kilometres, accounts for 10% of global warming due to CO2 alone. So reduce emissions of NOx and hydrocarbons by the use of three-way catalytic converters on all new cars worldwide. They've done that, 1 point. Insist on stricter speed limits in all countries. Not done. Fit carbon canisters to all new cars in order to mop up evaporative emissions, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, both from the engine and during refueling. This technology is available on all new US cars, but is not done in the UK. Fit low NOx burners on all fossil fuel power stations in the UK, and fit selective catalytic reduction on all new coal-fired stations. This has not been done. Monitor and reduce hydrocarbon uses by industry, mandatory recycling and reuse of solvents. Not done. Five-point checklist for reducing fluorocarbon emissions. Uncontrolled CFCs, which were ozone depleters, are also very powerful greenhouse gases, and if uncontrolled, would have contributed 50% of global warming due to CO2 alone by the year 2030. So the Montreal Protocol would have helped global warming had it not been for the fact that the substitutes they used were also greenhouse gases. So bring forward the phase-out date for fully halogenated CFCs to the end of 94, as in Germany. Not done. Uncontrolled HCFC 22, which is one of the CFC substitutes, will contribute 15% of global warming due to CO2 alone by the year 2030. Therefore, ban HCFC 22 by the year 2000. Not done. Uncontrolled HFCs, that should read, hydrofluorocarbons such as HFC 134A, will be contributing 15 to 20% of global warming due to CO2 alone by the end of the next century. Therefore, limit the use of these CFC substitutes by heavy tax penalties. Not done. Encouraged by financial measures the development of substitute technologies rather than substitute chemicals. Not done. Make recycling and reuse of CFCs mandatory. They did that. 1 point. Renewable energy. Separate the renewables from nuclear completely so that nuclear policy does not govern the future development of renewable energy or represent part of the non-fossil fuel obligation. Well, they have said they've done that, but I think they're rowing back from it, but I've given them a point for that. Extend the non-fossil fuel obligation period for renewables to a minimum of 12 to 15 years and include Scotland and Northern Ireland. Some renewables, such as tidal, will need even longer contract lengths. Not done. Set a challenging but achievable renewable target of 3,000 megawatts by 2000. Not achieved. Increase the R&D budget to reflect the potential of these non-polluting technologies. In the past 10 years, less than 250 million has been spent on renewables R&D, whilst more than 2 billion has been spent on nuclear R&D. Not done. Still spending a lot on nuclear. Exclude incineration from the non-fossil fuel obligations. Not done. So, from the last 4 checklists, there's another 3.5 points. So the total score is 7 points out of 40, which is 17.5% after 21 years. That is a spectacular political failure, and it may be down to the civil servants, or it may be down to the politicians. Personally, I think it's down to both. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Just like to clarify. If you go back a couple of slides. It's slightly sort of complicated by the fact that NOFO doesn't really exist any longer. So you have to sort of interpret it in the current parlance. Extend NOFO period for renewables to a minimum of 12 to 15 years and include Scotland, Northern Ireland. Some renewables such as tidal will need even longer contract lengths. The problem is, to my mind, the vertical integration of the electricity companies, you won't be surprised to hear, because it's quite difficult to get long contracts for the sale of electricity out of the vertically integrated companies. They effectively give it to themselves. Almost de facto, they give it to themselves. They claim not to, but really they do, because if you've got both parts, you've really got a long contract. Whereas others of us, maybe wanting to spend quite a bit of money on some new technology or something, really can't rely on that. And while there are vertically integrated companies, I think that's not going to happen. You can't. If you get long contracts, they're so discounted that you won't do it. So I think that obviously you can get rocks on some forms of energy, and I'm not sure what period you can sell them for. However, if you sell them long, you get reduced prices, which means it's less likely to do it. It's the point I would make there is it's the actual structure of vertically integrated industry that is the problem.
Can you just explain what exactly you mean by vertically integrated industry and
Yeah,
what are
I will do
rocks?
that. Basically, shall we say, let's take an example of Scottish and Southern. In Scotland, Scottish and Southern have power stations where they generate the electricity. They actually run the wires which transmit the electricity, which can have an influence on the value of the electricity that you make at the power stations. And then they also actually sell the electricity to the consumer. In the rest of this country, they don't actually. They don't transmit it. They both generate it and sell it. And it is actually the generating and the selling of it. So someone seeking to set themselves up as a generator, and there are some independent generators like Drax, which is the biggest one. There are bigger generators, but you're at a bit of a disadvantage, so you're not really competing on a level playing field. The same thing applies in the cement industry, where you have vertical integration. It sounds attractive. Maybe you think it's more efficient, but actually it destroys competition.
They got the whole thing locked up.
They've got it really stitched up, and they more than that. For instance, I applied to go on the Renewables Advisory Board twice, and twice they didn't even want to see me. Well, I've actually been in renewables probably longer than anybody else. I would think it's not a particularly idle post in this country. But I didn't even get an interview, and so did my son. If he was a bit younger, he went on it to apply to. I didn't. Actually, the establishment don't want to know alternative ideas. The electricity industry has it locked up. They're trying to get our policy in this country very much onto the basis of supply of electricity for energy. And electricity is an excellent form of energy, and of course it's going to be
For certain things. For certain
For
things.
certain things. It is not. For instance, for heat, where you generate the electricity, you get 40%, you then lose a bit of it on delivery. And then you use it to heat a house. You've 40%. If you took the wood that's been made, shall we say, to make that electricity in some places, remember it would have been made actually wood at 35% energy efficiency. You put that in a house, and you're 90% energy efficient for the use of the energy. It's irrelevant, and the electricity industry, the vial companies, have it locked up. They have the civil service eating out of their hands, and the ministers don't know how to deal with it. They don't actually understand, and they spout out stuff which is plainly rubbish. Very.
And what are ROCs?
Renewables Obligation Certificates.
Okay.
What you have, the Renewables Obligation Certificate, each supplier of electricity, which is one of the six, EDF, Scottish and Southern, Centrica, Scottish Electricity, RWE and E.ON, have to supply a certain percentage of the electricity that they supply as renewables. And in order to justify it being renewable, you get a ROC, a Renewable Obligation Certificate. If you're doing offshore wind, you get 2. If you do landfill gas, you get a quarter, I think, isn't it? And if you do wave, you get 5 ROCs. A ROC's worth about £45, sort of, if you sell it now.
But that's loading the market, isn't it?
Oh, it's putting a pressure on the consumer of the electricity. It's increasing a price, which is fine. Our argument was that if you're going to have ROCs, you should just have one ROC for everything, and then the cheapest form of generation of electricity would come forward first, and the ROC would increase in price because of the elapse of time and the scarcity of the ROCs available. But that was not accepted, and they decided to pick winners. They appointed Ernst & Young and all these accountants to determine exactly which form of electricity needed what support, which was a total nonsense, because each form of electricity, each plant needs a different amount, let alone each form of electricity. So it was total nonsense, really. And they determined that ours, anaerobic digestion, gets 2.
You said a quarter, didn't you?
No, we get anaerobic digestion gets 2.
Oh, does it? Okay. Well, that's good.
We argue that we shouldn't. We argue that we should just get that everybody should get the same amount, and then you would get the cheapest coming forward first. And if they needed more, they should increase the volume of the money.
Yeah.
But you should always get the cheapest. Instead, we have expensive stuff being developed and cheap stuff not being developed, and it's a travesty. It's a total waste of our resources. And by a level playing field, I don't ask for any more than level playing field. We should bring forward the cheapest first. It's simple. People know what they're doing. They know exactly what they're going to get.
While you've got the microphone, Peter, what do you think about nuclear?
Well, in my view, nuclear is just too expensive to do. I am worried about nuclear. I grew up when we all thought we might be obliterated, quite honestly, by nuclear bombs. And intrinsically, I'm suspicious about nuclear, but if it's really a cheap way of achieving reduction in carbon, well, perhaps we have to look that way. But we don't know about the disposal of waste. We really don't know what it's going to cost. They haven't really disposed of any yet. Fast breeder reactors don't seem to be being done. the fusion technology is as far away from viability now as it was when I left school. The insurance issue is totally uncertain. Nuclear electricity looks to me like very expensive. In particular, it doesn't work with wind, because nuclear power stations like to be run at a constant level, and wind has to generate when the wind blows. Well, you could have, with the policy that we've got, we could have a time, and we have had times, it has happened, when they've told wind to turn off because there isn't the demand. So in the relatively limited amount of time that the wind blows, which is under half of it in whichever way you like to look at it, and in many cases under a quarter, when it's, they actually have to turn off and pay them to turn off. It's ridiculous. The mix of nuclear and wind is a very bad mix.
Because it's very difficult to shut down and fire up a nuclear reactor quickly.
They don't like, they will go up and down a bit, I believe, but they don't like it, and in particular it's very expensive to do it, because you've got such an enormous capital cost that it's not running all the time. The capital cost becomes even worse, and the cost of the electricity is even more, because nearly all the, or a large part of the costs of nuclear, on the face of it, are in the capital, repaying the capital costs. But then there's the hidden ones of insurance and waste disposal, which they've not taken account of. So for me, nuclear is just too expensive. And we don't know, none of us know, when some new technology is going to come forward that actually completely transforms the supply of energy. You told me about the one with carbon dioxide, fixing carbon dioxide yesterday. It isn't exactly what it would produce some electricity, it isn't exactly a total, but it's a big step. There could be some technological movement, like the change from flint axes to bronze, that completely transform it. We must do the cheapest forms now. And I'm always considered, when I'm with Greens, I'm considered a skeptic, and when I'm an outright skeptic, and when I'm with skeptics, I'm considered an outright Green. I'm neither. I think you should take the practical options, the reasonably priced, costed options, so that we can remain internationally competitive, and give every type of technology, and let 1,000, 1 million flowers bloom of people having ideas, with a simple, basic system of support and taxation of fossil fuels. So we do safeguard fossil fuels for the future. We use the cheaper forms of renewables now. And as time goes on, maybe other technologies will come forward, in which case it would have been ridiculous to support lots of offshore wind mills which become
obsolete.
Relics, or they don't, in which case, well, we will have to up the support so that other ideas come forward. That's my view. I'm neither a skeptic, I'm an agnostic.
Thank you for that.